What happened to Dragon Ball Super? Why did its biggest fans hate it? How did it stay so popular despite its many issues? And what are the odds that it comes back in 2026? In this video, I'm gonna look back at how Dragon Ball Super completely saved the Dragon Ball community, discuss how its weird release schedule almost ruined its potential, and explain why everyone is dying for this anime to come back. And I already know what you're thinking. I'm overhyping things, and Dragon Ball Super was never that popular. Which couldn't be more wrong. Dragon Ball recently made a bit of a comeback with its new anime Dragon Ball Daima. Mind you, this came out like 6 years after Dragon Ball Super ended, but it was one of the most popular anime during its run, and it's still getting a bunch of views on sites like Crunchyroll. Needless to say, Dragon Ball is one of the most highly demanded anime in the entire industry, and this was true throughout the entire history of Dragon Ball Super. And this is exactly why Dragon Ball Super was such an incredible series for the fandom. It's undeniable that without Dragon Ball Super, Dragon Ball wouldn't be nearly as popular as it is today. To put it another way, the success of Dragon Ball Super made Dragon Ball even more popular and actually saved it from falling into obscurity. Now to that you might say, well, what the hell are you talking about? Dragon Ball is Shonen Jump's biggest series and everyone loves it. It was never obscure, which is true, but you have to understand that Dragon Ball is in a completely different spot from where it was 20 years ago. Back then, the series was practically dead. The Dragon Ball Z anime originally ended at the start of 1996. It was immediately followed by GT, which quickly ended in November of 1997. So the anime officially ended well before the year 2000, not considering the English dub that ended in 2005. In the meantime, Funimation was also dubbing all of the movies like The Tree of Might, Cooler's Revenge, The Legendary Super Saiyan, and Wrath of the Dragon. This meant that Dragon Ball was pretty much dead in Japan, but in the West, fans were in this weird state of purgatory, where we were technically getting content, but also not really. And that's pretty much the 2000s in a nutshell when it comes to Dragon Ball. The anime was gone. The manga had been finished and was never coming back. During this time, there were 4 things that just barely kept the series alive. Legacy, which as we now know will only get you so far. The movies, which were technically already 10 years old and really only came out on VHS and DVD. The video games, such as Budokai Tenkaichi 3 and Raging Blast, which all had a huge impact on the anime's later return as they're still some of the most played video games. And we can't forget the Dragon Ball community itself, which kept the series alive by not only buying the DVDs and the games, but also creating many fan discussions as well as abridged videos and parodies on YouTube. In particular, 2 of the most important parodies at the time were Alternate Reality Dragon Ball Z, a parody series on YouTube that came out in 2006 and was created by the YouTuber Gozar, and then the now infamous Dragon Ball Z Abridged by Team 4-Star. In fact, it's these kinds of parodies that really define the 2000s era of Dragon Ball, because we weren't really getting new content, but fans were so hungry for Dragon Ball that they decided to make their own content. So on top of the sales from video games and other merchandise, it was only a matter of time before Shueisha realized just how badly fans wanted Dragon Ball to come back. So, in 2013, with the help of Akira Toriyama himself, they dropped the movie that started a new era of Dragon Ball, Dragon Ball Z Battle of Gods. Fans had their minds blown not just because Dragon Ball was finally back, but also because Toriyama was heavily involved in the movie, and the movie was set before GT, a series which was well liked at the time but wasn't quite as well rated as Dragon Ball Z. And of course, fans were even more excited to meet the new characters Beerus and Whis and find out that Goku would get a new Super Saiyan God transformation. Naturally, the movie was a box office success, making over $7 million in its first 2 days in Japan and making almost $3 million in its first week in North America. At this point, regardless of whether they already intended to or not, Toei and Shueisha really had no choice but to bring Dragon Ball back. So in June of 2015, Toei debuted the long-awaited return of the anime with Dragon Ball Super. Now fans were in a brand new era of Dragon Ball, marked by the return of new episodes every week, as well as a new wave of Dragon Ball fans. And this is why I say that Dragon Ball and its fandom would not be what they are today without Dragon Ball Super. The fact is that this movie saved Dragon Ball. If it hadn't been for that first movie, we wouldn't have got a brand new generation of anime fans. Toei would really only have One Piece, and the industry as a whole might have been way less popular. With Dragon Ball revived and relevant again, fans were going back to the classics like Naruto and Bleach, but they were also checking out all of the newer anime like Fairy Tail, Attack on Titan, or even less action-packed series like Kaguya-sama Love is War. The fact is, anime is more popular than ever, and a large part of that is thanks to this renaissance that followed the return of Dragon Ball. That being said, Dragon Ball Super was met with a number of issues. In fact, Dragon Ball Super still has one of the worst starts to an anime there has ever been. But what happened? Everyone loved the movie, so how bad could the show have really been? Actually, there were two problems. The first problem was actually not the anime, but the new Dragon Ball Super manga and the fact that it came out just before the anime, which might not sound unusual to some people, but anyone who follows manga knows that's not how it works. First, you make the manga. Then after a few years or so, it gets picked up for an anime. That way you have at least 100 chapters of space between the anime and manga. But the Dragon Ball Super manga started several weeks before the first episode of the anime. It then skips the intro arc and the Resurrection of F movie, which had just come out in the spring of that year, and jumps right into the Universe 6 saga. At the time, it made sense because obviously Shueisha wanted to capitalize on the hype and drop the manga at the same time as the anime, but now it's kind of weird because if you start the manga, then there's just chunks of the story missing. That being said, if you read the manga, then you probably watch the anime, meaning this isn't such a big deal, it's just really weird. The real problem at the time was the beginning of the anime and the fact that it just sucked. On the one hand, it was nice because we got some additional content like the new opening, as well as some episodes that fleshed out more of the slice of life aspects in the intro arc. But that's just it. The anime starts by recapping the movie, and when I say recap, I mean they dragged out the movie everyone had already seen across 15 episodes. That means the whole first season of the show, or core if you want to get technical, is basically all a recap. They then follow that up with another recap for the Frieza saga, which at this point had already been out for like half a year. Following this arc, fans had watched 27 episodes that all amounted to recap of movies they had already seen. Oh, and to top it all off, the animation was a complete mixed bag of some of the best fights ever and some of the worst animation Toei has ever released. Like, if you're a One Piece fan, you might remember those episodes with Robin where it just looked god-awful. Yeah, Dragon Ball Super was worse. And this kind of thing happened often enough that on top of the recap, a lot of fans kind of just dropped the anime early on. So ironically, the anime that was saving Dragon Ball was also a huge disappointment. It was great to have the anime back, and at times it looked amazing, but it was just recapping the movies, and the animation was criminally inconsistent. So with all of the hype that went into the anime in the summer of 2015, a lot of it died out by the end of that year. But then Dragon Ball Super would make a comeback in 2016 once it finally dropped some original content. This year marked a huge shift in the story as it featured the series' first tournament arc, a staple of Dragon Ball, in the form of the Universe 6 arc, which was then followed by the Goku Black arc. Universe 6 went about as you would expect, with fans happy to see Dragon Ball return to its roots, as well as introduce new characters like Cabba and the Universe 6 Saiyans, and the new fan favorite, Hit. Following the success of that arc, Dragon Ball fans were ready to love Super again, which exploded when everyone found out Future Trunks was coming back, and he was fighting an evil Goku. And not like Raditz or Turles, like a legit evil Goku. Unfortunately, as as most anime fans are aware, this arc turned out to be incredibly divisive, as it fell into a lot of the same traps any story with time travel has, and has what many fans consider some of the most inconsistent writing choices in the series, on par with some of the choices made in the Boo saga. For all of the stuff people loved, like the return of future Trunks and the appearance of Vegito, a lot of people were let down by the Goku Black arc, which was sad because there was so much hype going into this arc, and because Dragon Ball Super finally seemed like it was coming back after the last year of frankly shitty recap episodes. And this was where Dragon Ball Super really hit a wall. Fans were conditioned by this point to just not expect much from Dragon Ball Super story-wise. There was no sign of a new movie, and while many Dragon Ball fans were enjoying the manga, it didn't get nearly as much attention as the anime, which, as you can see, was a constant roller coaster. Fortunately, as manga fans were expecting, the anime made a huge turnaround with the anime's final arc, the Tournament of Power. The Tournament of Power is the epitome of the Dragon Ball Super anime. It's one giant tournament which is also set up by another tournament arc. It starts out with a painful amount of filler episodes, which honestly just aren't that good. And even when you get to the real episodes, the pacing sucks. But despite all that, you get a ton of cool transformations, all kinds of new characters like the new Saiyan girls, a ton of beautifully animated fights by some of the best animators in the industry, and you had the high stakes of Goku learning Ultra Instinct in order to defeat Jiren, a transformation so iconic that it would cross into every form of pop culture. Hence why Ultra Instinct Shaggy is somehow a thing. For all the issues Dragon Ball Super had, the Tournament of Power was seen as a massive success. While the anime may have been a roller coaster of wild ups and downs, it ended on a great note, and thousands of fans felt crushed when they finally lost their favorite show that they'd been watching every Saturday night for 3 years. Thankfully, Toei followed this up with 2 more great movies, which followed in suit with the anime. Despite having some story decisions that fans weren't crazy about, everyone enjoyed these stories and loved the new characters and animation. But the release of the second movie brings us to where we are now. We just got Dragon Ball Daima, but it's been 7 years since Dragon Ball Super ended, and there's also no sign of when the manga might come back, which really just leaves us with 2 questions. What is the legacy of Dragon Ball Super, and what does that mean for the future of Dragon Ball? Well, we can already see what's happening. Sadly, Akira Toriyama passed away last March, but we were still able to get another new anime in the form of Daima. Unfortunately, this means that we probably won't be getting a brand new Dragon Ball series for a while. They've more or less adapted all of the spin-offs, so they could either do a sequel to Daima, or they could finally adapt the remaining arcs of Dragon Ball Super, namely the Goro arc and the Granola arc. If the past is any kind of indicator, they'll probably drop a new movie first, and that'll give us some idea of what they'll do next. Dragon Ball has been full of surprises since the Battle of Gods movie, so it's hard to say what'll happen next. But it's because of Dragon Ball Super that I can confidently say Dragon Ball isn't going anywhere anytime soon. It's impossible to go back to the way things were in the 2000s, because Dragon Ball has already come back and saved itself thanks to Dragon Ball Super and its anime. Say what you will about the crappy animation or the divisive story, but the fights and characters were amazing, and they got the world excited for Dragon Ball again. It got us excited to watch a bunch of new movies that weren't just straight to DVD, and it even led to one of the best video games of all time, Dragon Ball FighterZ. We could get a sequel to that considering how well it did, but I wouldn't hold my breath while Arxis works on Marvel Tokon. We also got the Super manga, which I honestly kind of like better than the anime. Don't get me wrong, I'll pick the anime over the manga every day, but the pacing is so much better in the manga. Say what you will about Toyotaro, but he does a nice job of adapting Toriyama's art style, and he really does honor the story of Dragon Ball's characters. The Moro arc is the best of Dragon Ball's weird space-age mystic nonsense, and the Granola arc redefines the Saiyan pride that got so many of us hooked on the original series. For these reasons, I think it's only a matter of time before the Dragon Ball Super anime makes its return. The story is already there and manga fans love it. And even with its issues, everyone is a little bit happier whenever we can all watch brand new episodes of Dragon Ball.